they call it BBB, biostatistics, bioinformatics, and biomathematics. And then she had given several presentations and then also talked about chaired ethical consideration, ethics issues with statistics and data science. So without wasting any further time, let's welcome Dr. Trachtenberg. The topic of her presentation today is ethical data science. So again, as I say all the time, put your cameras on and then let's wave to Dr. Trachtenberg and then welcome her to today's presentation. So Rochelle, it's all yours. And thank you.
Okay. So unfortunately, hello everyone. What Cisco Systems does not want me to share my screen. So I cannot share my screen. John, I may need you to help me out. Otherwise, we're going to be here for 20 minutes while I try to sort my technical issues, which is probably going to take more than 20 minutes.
So we have IT experts here. Nana, are you there? Or Stacy, anybody can help with the sharing?
Yes, just give me a second. Let me look at it.
So when I go to share, it says open system preferences. And it says I have to quit the system. Oh, it said now I'm the presenter, but it says I have to quit the system before it will update, which means I might have to log out.
Yes, you might have to log out and then close it and then log back in.
Okay. I apologize. Unless one of you can share your screen and has the nope, it still won't let me share. Awesome. Okay. So thanks for that fantastic introduction. You're all looking enthusiastic, and John is right. You absolutely need to have some awareness of ethical issues, and I'm going to leave the meeting. While I'm gone and trying to log back in, I want to encourage you to follow the link that maybe Nana sent to you to look at the ASA, American Statistical Association, Ethical Guidelines for Statistical Practice. It's important that you have a look at these guidelines, even if you don't call yourself a statistician, or if you belong to the Royal Statistical Society or the Statistical Society of Canada instead of the American Statistical Association. But the past 5 years, Committee on Professional Ethics members have been working, including myself, have been working to understand the relevance of the ASA ethical guidelines for the data scientist or not statistician. So I'm gonna log off. I want to invite you / urge you to look at the guidelines, and I'll be right back, I hope. Hello again. You're all bearing witness to a miracle. That's the first time I've ever been successful with a technical challenge. Okay, so I assume you can see me / hear me?
Yes, everybody can
Awesome,
hear you.
thank you. Okay, and now I'm hoping to be sharing now Microsoft PowerPoint. Okay, here you are. So can anyone confirm, do you see my slides?
Yes, they're
Yeah.
working.
Okay, so you see the top slide, the front slide?
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, great. So now I understand sort of the WebEx display as well. Okay, fantastic. So we're going to be talking about ethical data science. As John mentioned, I'm at Georgetown University, but I reckon the reason why he invited me to give this lecture is because of my very long-term engagement with professional ethics in the practice of statistics and data science. I chaired the first working group for revising the ASA ethical guidelines. So we were the first to update them since 1995. That work started in 2014, was completed in 2016 when they were approved by the board. We then revised them again in 2018. And in 2016, the board of the ASA determined that the guidelines should be revised or reviewed for revisions every 5 years. So I am co-chairing the working group for revising the ASA ethical guidelines this year, 2021. So I am one of the most experienced people in the world when it comes to thinking and talking about ethical guidelines for statistical and data science practice. So if you have any questions about the guidelines, okay, sorry. I just saw a message and I don't see how to monitor the messages. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat, and forgive me for not stopping. If we were together, I would stop and answer your questions, but I don't use WebEx, so I'm not really sure how to make your questions appear to me. So keep your question in mind, type it into the chat, and as soon as I'm done, we will talk. I will answer your questions if I don't answer them through the course of the presentation today. So quickly, I'm going to talk about the ASA ethical guidelines for statistical practice, and those are, as I said, you were sent the URL for the current, which is the 2018 ethical guidelines. They are always at the end of that link, and the ethical guidelines for statistical practice are available to people outside the ASA. You don't have to be a member to log in. They are a dynamic representation of the practice, and they are relevant whether you consider yourself to be a statistician or a data scientist or neither. But the most important thing about the ethical guidelines for statistical practice is that whenever you are engaging in statistical practice, they pertain to you. So we'll talk a little bit about those, but it's 54 elements. And the more important thing that we're going to be focusing on is what I call the data science pipeline. And I will show you how the ASA ethical guidelines apply or pertain or can be utilized in every single step along the data science pipeline. But that's background information. Understanding where you are in the science pipeline is certainly important. Understanding that there are ethical guidelines for your practice so that you can do your data science ethically is important. But the most important thing is that to recognize that you are making decisions about whether to practice ethically, what to do if your practice or you're exposed to someone who is practicing in a not ethical way. You have to make decisions. So we're not going to talk about stakeholders very much, but when you make a decision, it affects people, either people down the line because your work gets forwarded to another person who then works with the results or output of your effort, or your work is published and someone else will read your work and needs to make decisions based on your work. Those people who are affected by the work that you do, the decisions that you make, are stakeholders. They play a role in your decision making because you want to make sure that you limit harms to stakeholders, that you do not mislead or promote misleading stakeholders. So those stakeholders are important, but we're not going to talk a lot about them. If you are an instructor or if you're going to be teaching a statistics or a data science course and you want to incorporate ethical content into that course, stakeholder analysis is a nice way to do that. And I wrote a paper all about how to do that, which you can email me for. It's a white paper and it's available in the social science archives. Then we're going to talk about how to actually do the ethical decision making using ethical reasoning and the data science pipeline. So the last thing We're going to do some background, and then we're going to look at making actual decisions. I want to also tell you that all the materials, you can see all the slides are copyrighted. All the materials that I'm going to be talking about, you can get papers. If there's a paper about it, I put them up on my academia.edu webpage, but I have 2 books on ethical reasoning to promote ethical statistics and data science, and they're in review right now. So the guidelines, as you saw, are categorized in these 7 general areas, and each general area in the guidelines describes what is professional integrity and accountability for the statistics or data science practitioner. And then there are 7 in the 2018 version, 7 particular examples of what it looks like to be ethical and demonstrate your professional integrity and accountability. There are 11 ways specifically to maintain the integrity of data and methods. There are 5 specific ways to demonstrate or exercise your responsibilities to the scientific community, the public, your funder, or the client. So this table just shows you sort of the overall areas of ethical responsibilities for the practitioner in statistics and data science, and how many specific elements there are. As I mentioned, there are 54 elements in the 2018 guidelines. It's not enough to look at or have memorized these items. What you need to recognize is that ethical practice in statistics and data science is more complex than don't lie, be honest, and you as a practitioner have responsibilities to many different stakeholders in terms of your practice, not just to complete your work on time, but to actually consider how research subjects will be affected by your work, how the scientific community will be affected by your work. So those are stakeholders, and the guidelines are organized to highlight the responsibilities that you have for each of those stakeholders. Oh, sorry, on this slide, and this is in your PDF stack of slides, is the URL that you can follow to get the guidelines. Okay, when you look at the top, the preamble to the ethical guidelines, they articulate their purpose. They exist to help statistics practitioners make and communicate decisions ethically, and also to inform those relying on statistical analysis, including employers, colleagues, and the public, of the standards that they should expect. In these 2 senses, the guidelines exist for the statistician and data scientist, and also for the consumer of data science and statistics outputs. Most importantly, the guidelines should be used for both those whose primary occupation is statistics and those in all other disciplines who use statistical methods in their professional work. You might find that to seem overbearing on the part of the statistical community, but in fact, the Association of Computing Machinery also have a similar articulation that the ACM guidelines are for all ACM members, absolutely, but also for those who use computing. When you use the tools of a discipline, you are responsible for using them ethically. So ASA guidelines are complex. If it was sufficient for me to just hand them out and then you would automatically be an ethical statistician or a data science practitioner, then we'd be done now. But it's not, so we're not. So we're going to talk a little bit about the data science pipeline. These are 7 tasks that have to happen at some point whenever you are engaged in statistical practice, but also in data science. You have to plan or design what you're going to do. You need to collect, munch, or wrangle data. You need to do some kind of analysis that you either run yourself or you program to run. You need to interpret or program to interpret the outputs of the analysis. You need to report your interpretation and communicate about what you've done in steps 1 through 4. You need to document your work so that you know what you've done and others can replicate what you've done or can recognize what you've done. And in many cases, you have to work on a team. So these tasks are essential. And in fact, by matching ASA guidelines to the tasks, you'll be able to see how, even if you do not consider the ASA ethical guidelines for statistical practice to be relevant to data science, by breaking down the tasks involved in both statistics and data science, we can see very clearly that the guidelines do pertain. So this is something that you can do for yourself. You can do this anytime, no matter what the guidelines look like. So you can go to the 2016 version, 2018 version, 2021 version. You can go to any version and do a simple visual search. For task 1, plan or design. That's the first task in your data science or statistics project. Your visual scan of the guidelines is to discover if anything in the guidelines is relevant to planning. So it's a very simple search. When you take the tasks in the data science pipeline and you use the tasks to guide your search through the guidelines for anything that may be relevant. So if you read the text of Principle A, which is the principle about professional integrity and accountability, what you will see is the principle states you need to really understand the data and the methods so that no matter what you plan or design, it will produce results that are valid, interpretable, and reproducible. So this is true, as you can see, for statistics or data science, irrespective of where you are in the, where you are in your project, the plan needs to be done ethically. So what else in the ASA guidelines? I mean, we read the preamble, and now we're just at the first principle, and the first sentence basically says whatever you plan to do needs to lead to work that is valid, reliable, and valid, interpretable, and reproducible. But what else in the ethical guidelines is relevant? And by relevant, I mean could possibly be related to or support you planning or designing in an ethical way. A, which is professional integrity and accountability. C, which is describes your responsibilities to the client or employer. And E, which describes your responsibilities to other people on your team, other research colleagues. Each one of them has at least one element that is relevant to planning in an ethical way. So you can see that in A.1, the first item in Principle A is that the ethical statistician identifies and mitigates any preferences on the part of the investigators or data providers that might predetermine or influence the analyses or results. So if there are influences from the data providers or the investigators, and they want you to come out with a certain answer, a certain result, you're obviously in the planning stage because they're telling you what they want at the end, so you need to plan to get that thing at the end. But the ethical practitioner mitigates those preferences, does not follow those preferences. That seems like it's an unfair burden for the statistician who is hired by an investigator ostensibly to get the answer that they want. But in fact, it does not serve science, and it is a waste of resources if you fail to apply the scientific method or be objective as you plan your statistical or data science project. It may get the job done and it may make your investigator happy, but it is a disservice to the scientific community and the funder and is a waste of resources. So it is not ethical. It is not consistent with the ASA ethical guidelines for practice. Similarly, when you consider you have responsibilities to science and the public, as well as the client, funder, or employer, when you have a variety of alternatives that are equally valid, they will vary in scope, cost, or precision. So as you plan your study, you have an ethical obligation to present the person who has these options with the choices and explain what may be the strengths and limitations of the different options. And E3 avoids compromising scientific validity for expediency is probably one of the most powerful elements of the ASA ethical guidelines for any practitioner, because people may say, I need this study done quickly. I need the study done cheaply. I need the study done with only 6 subjects. Those are all issues of expediency and will not generate a scientifically valid result. So E3 reminds the ethical practitioner of their responsibility to avoid compromising scientific validity for expediency. Now, these are just the three elements of the 54 in this 9-page document that you can easily match to the planning or design task. There are others, and depending on the situation that you find yourself in, you may find other aspects of the guidelines that will be equally or more compelling. So moving down the pipeline to task 2, which by most reports, data scientists spend the majority of their time doing, which is collecting, munging, or wrangling data. Principle D6 specifically states, in contemplating whether to participate in an analysis of data from a particular source, the ethical practitioner refuses to do so if participating in the analysis could reasonably be interpreted by individuals who provided information as sanctioning a violation of their rights. Now, this is true whether the individuals who provided the information are animals who don't necessarily interpret things or human subjects, and D is the principle about human subjects. But this one particularly describes the ethical practitioner's responsibility to consider the provenance of the data they're being asked to analyze. But that's not the only aspect of the ASA ethical guidelines for practice that specifically speaks to collecting, munging, or wrangling data. A also has at least one principle, and this was actually the one that we saw was relevant to planning. If you've moved past the planning stage and you're at the data collection or munging or wrangling stage, you still need to understand that data providers or investigators may want you to only look at certain variables or munge something with something else so that the results come out the way they want. So what's important on this slide is to note that principle or element A1 is relevant for planning, and it remains relevant as you move through the data science pipeline. So and this is something that you would find in a simple visual search, but it's not just A, but B, which might be the principle you think is most relevant because it outlines your responsibilities to maintain the integrity of the data and the methods. B5 states that the ethical practitioner clearly and fully reports the steps taken to preserve data integrity. So, excuse me, that's clearly relevant for the collection, munging, or wrangling of data. And C5, again, which is about your responsibility to others, that you understand and conform to confidentiality requirements in data collection. So these are three easily matched aspects of the ethical guidelines that are relevant to data collection, munging, or wrangling, but there are others. I hope you are not disturbed by my huge dog barking. He's in another room, but this is the Zoom economy, is listening to other people's dogs and cats. Anyway, so moving down the pipeline, we have task 3, which is to analyze, either perform the analysis or program to perform an analysis. The biggest surprise I think that people find is that the ASA ethical guidelines for statistical practice are not limited to analysis. So here you see 3 completely different principles we haven't talked about yet, D, G, and H. G is about misconduct. H is about the employer of the statistician supporting ethical practice. And D is about considerations in, actually, I forgot what D is about. But the point here is that we have relevant to analysis. D6 says specifically, as we saw before, in contemplating whether to participate in an analysis of data, the ethical practitioner refuses to do so if participating in the analysis could reasonably be interpreted by individuals who provided information as sanctioning a violation of their rights. If data are scraped inadvertently or just at basically with no information about consent, then your analysis or programming of analysis of that data would reasonably be interpreted by those individuals whose information was unconsented, scraped. It may be interpreted by them as a sanctioning of this violation of their rights. So you don't want, the ethical practitioner would not agree to program that analysis or to perform that analysis. And similarly, condoning scientific or professional misconduct that is represented by stealing people's data or scraping it without their consent, that would actually happen if you agreed to do the analysis of that data. And if you are an investigator and you scrape or obtain data without consent, without sufficient consent, that is incompetent and or corrupt statistical practice. So the ethical employer makes sure that the workplace does not support that kind of work. And there are other aspects of the guidelines that relate to this particular task. After the analysis, or once the analysis happens, there will be some kind of results, and task number 4 in the pipeline is to interpret. Interpretation is much more abstract of an activity, and the guidelines are written to support statisticians who simply write the analysis plan, who simply execute a plan, who then summarize the plan or tabulate the results, as well as the statistician who is a collaborator from the start, helps design the study, helps collect and interpret and quality check the data, and then is there to help interpret the results. So the guidelines are meant to help you at every task, specifically to do the task, but also if you are engaged from the start to the finish, you, the statistician or data scientist, may be engaged in the interpretation. The ethical statistician, again, we saw before, avoids compromising scientific validity for expediency. If your paper is published this week, you can put it in the grant, so you really need to do that. That's expedient. If you need to do sensitivity checks or correct for multiple comparisons, and that's going to make all your significant p-values go away, that's scientifically valid and may undermine the expediency of the requester. But the ethical practitioner makes sure not to compromise scientific validity of the results. And again, the ethical practitioner avoids condoning or appearing to condone statistical, scientific, or professional misconduct, and someone who cherry picks results, who particularly fails to correct for multiple comparisons so that significant p-values don't disappear. Those are statistical and scientific misconduct, and the ethical practitioner needs to do what they can to avoid that. And those employing statisticians are expected to recognize that the results of valid statistical work cannot be guaranteed to conform to the expectations or desires of those commissioning the work. So interpretation, although it is more of an abstract aspect of statistical and data science practice, nevertheless is part of the data science continuum, and the ethical practitioner of statistics and data scientist has these obligations to ensure that even at the interpretation stage, the work is valid and ethically done. So task 5 in the pipeline is to report and communicate. The ethical guidelines actually have a lot of the word reporting comes up a lot. So this is one of the easiest tasks in the data science pipeline to do your simple visual search. You can look more deeply, but looking just for the word report will get you multiple examples, including from B, which is integrity of the data and methods, E, which is working on a team with other colleagues, and H, which is the responsibilities of those employing statisticians. Importantly, B talks about reporting the limitations of inference and possible sources of error. That's pretty straightforward. But E, when you're communicating with other people on your teams, the ethical practitioner ensures that all discussion, that's the communication, and reporting of statistical and design and analysis is consistent with these guidelines. Basically, E tells the practitioner to loop back to principle B to make sure that the integrity of the data and the integrity of the methods are respected by all members of the research team, not just the ethical practitioner. This is possibly one of the most challenging aspects of statistical and data science practice, because we may discuss and report aspects of the ethical of the design, but the person who ultimately does the reporting, the first author, for example, or the principal investigator of our project, may think, oh my God, I don't want to see every design element. I just want to know, was P less than 0.05? Hopefully that is not an experience that most of you are having, but it pretty much describes my entire first 10 years as a statistician. So task 6 in the data science pipeline is documentation. Documentation is only subtly different from reporting and communication, but in other conversations I've had in other disciplines, communication and reporting really have to do with the direct results of your work and how you share that, what you've done and how it worked, the actual purpose of your work with others. Whereas documentation is for yourself, others like you, people on your team, or the next statistician who comes after you. So the documentation of what you have done is not as easy to identify in your visual search of the guidelines, but you can see A6 accepts full responsibility for his or her professional performance. That is a really broad principle or element from the professional integrity and accountability principle, principle A. But when you are called to provide expert testimony, or you are the expert of record in written work, if you give oral presentations, every bit of the communication that you do needs to reflect your professional performance and your integrity. B, which is about the integrity of the data and the methods, those need to be documented fully. So clearly and fully reports the steps taken to preserve data integrity and valid results. Those are part of your documentation obligations. And E for, again, this isn't communicating with others on your research team, strives to promote transparency in design, execution, and reporting or presenting of all analyses. Those are other aspects of documentation, but there are yet other aspects of the ASA ethical guidelines that are relevant in that task. So the final task in the pipeline is working on a team. It's obviously not the last thing you do. It's pretty much the context within which you're going to be doing each of the first 6 tasks in the pipeline. And because a lot of statisticians, the majority of statisticians work in a team setting, it's ubiquitous throughout the ASA ethical guidelines. It's one of the most important things about working on a team is respect for other people, particularly the people in the workplace. So in the preamble, it states that ethical practice does not include, promote, or tolerate any type of professional or scientific misconduct. Full stop. When you're working on a team, you wouldn't do professional or scientific misconduct. You wouldn't promote it, and you would do what you can to make sure it is not tolerated, promoted, or included in your team. That's a full stop for how the ethical practitioner of statistics or data science has specific responsibilities with respect to other people and professional and scientific misconduct prevention, as well as not engaging in it when they work on a team. B11, you might be surprised to notice it's about the data and the integrity of methods, but it also has informative elements with respect to working on a team, including striving to promptly correct any errors that are discovered while producing the final report or after publication, and dissemination of the correction, specifically to those who rely on the results, which would be, if you publish a paper, others who might be citing your results. And again, we come back to G1, avoids, the ethical practitioner avoids condoning or appearing to condone statistical, scientific, or professional misconduct. So those are all aspects, different aspects of the ASA ethical guidelines that are relevant for every one of the tasks. Many of the guidelines have principles that are relevant for more than one task. As we saw, G1 kept coming back, D6 kept coming back, and A kept coming back. The guidelines are relevant to aspects of practice beyond analysis, and many people are surprised by that because some people who are not statisticians think that that's the only thing that a statistician does. But the ethical guidelines support ethical statistics and data science practice. As you saw, many of the principles are relevant no matter where you are, whether you're a data scientist or the PI, an investigator, you must always treat people with respect, for example. So the ASA ethical guidelines support ethical data science why is this talk not over? Because I guarantee you it is not. You can use the ASA ethical guidelines as you work through the tasks in the data science pipeline to make sure that what you do is ethical. But hopefully that's going to be what happens to you 90% of your career. Sometimes other people make decisions and we must respond. So in those cases, our ethical practice may not be sufficient. So you're going along your pipeline, you're using the guidelines to make sure every step in the pipeline is done ethically. And then someone does something. They ask you to cherry pick. They tell you not to report a certain p-value or don't correct for multiple comparisons. When you encounter a situation like that, you practice ethically, but somebody else requires you to react to their request or statement, and we need a method to respond. The response to a situation like that is to make a decision. To know whether or not you've made the right decision, you should try to justify that decision. If you can justify it, then it's probably a good decision. And you can make the decision and justify it using the ASA ethical guidelines. So it's not just good for practice, it's also good for making decisions when you encounter unethical behavior. So now we're going to shift gears slightly and talk about ethical reasoning, which is where you take what you know about the ethical guidelines and what you know about the data science pipeline and use them to make sure that what you do is ethical. But when you have to respond to another person or another person's actions, you can do that as well. So the whole crux of this section of the talk is when an ethical challenge arises, first you have to recognize it, and then you have to make a decision about it. So this is a 6-step way that the Santa Clara Makala Center published decades ago about ethical reasoning. So this is an established paradigm. What I've done is applied it to the context of ethical statistical practice and data science practice. So the first thing that you do in ethical reasoning is to assess your prerequisite knowledge. That's general. In this case, as a data scientist or a statistics practitioner, you can use the ASA ethical guidelines. So obviously, today may be the first time you ever even heard about them. So you can read through them now at your leisure, recognizing that that constitutes sort of your background knowledge. Something that you may want to do, this is key in the ethical decision-making paradigm, but tends to be more challenging to non-ethicists and non-philosophers. But identifying relevant decision-making frameworks could be important to you if you are American or European, for example, or operating in those environments. And I'll give you an example. There are 2 decision-making frameworks for ethical decision-making. One is called virtue ethics and one is called utilitarianism. There are many others, but I just focus on these 2 because they are the most straightforward to understand, number 1. And number 2, the ASA guidelines are written from a virtue ethics perspective. And the Association for Computing Machinery is written from a utilitarian perspective. So that's why I chose those 2 to emphasize in this ethical reasoning paradigm description. The virtue ethics perspective is the kind of perspective where you say, what would the ethical statistician do? So the virtue ethics perspective asks you to decide based on what you think the most ethical person would do or the most ethical practitioner would do. If you're using the ASA guidelines, that means use the ASA ethical guidelines. That's the virtue perspective. The utilitarianism perspective is utilized in the Association of Computing Machinery guidelines. If you are a computing professional who uses statistics some of the time, the ACM guidelines may be what you use. They are much more heavily influenced by European thought, and the Europeans tend to prioritize minimizing harms and maximizing benefits, specifically the social good or the public good. That is a utilitarian perspective. So you may want to say, I want to use the ASA ethical guidelines, so I'm going to use a virtue perspective, or I'm going to look in the ACM guidelines because I want to be more utilitarian about my decision making. That's up to you, really. Once you have that background in blue, then you need to be able to recognize an ethical issue and that a decision must be made. Now, the guidelines that we just went through and that you now have a document reflecting, the guidelines can help you pinpoint what the ethical issue is. And then once you've identified one, you need to identify and evaluate alternative actions. How do you respond? What are the decisions that I could make? Then you need to make and justify a decision and then reflect on the decision. So you're going to spend the majority of your career working on number one, identifying or thinking about your prerequisite knowledge. There's a lot to know, and all you have to do is practice ethically most of the time. In the case where you have to make a response, then you would engage in the rest of these guidelines. So I just want to summarize our prerequisite knowledge to this point. You have the ethical guidelines. They are practice standards. They tell you how to do your job, each task ethically. We have 7 tasks. You need to make decisions in each of those 7 tasks. If you are participating in the entire pipeline, if you are only participating in one stage or task of the pipeline, you still have to make decisions in order to do that job ethically. Each of the tasks has relevant aspects from the ASA ethical guidelines. So now sorry, my computer is super slow, old and slow. Okay, so prerequisite knowledge is just beginning, which is why I spent the first entire half of the talk talking about the ASA ethical guidelines. Understanding what is in the guidelines isn't enough. You need to be able to, or you need to remember that they're there to help you, as it says in the preamble, make and communicate decisions that you make ethically. When you get to KSA 3, though, identifying the ethical challenge, you can use the guidelines just like you were using them to practice ethically. You can use the guidelines to understand if or identify if an ethical challenge arises. If someone does something and it violates the guidelines, then that's the ethical issue. So if somebody wants to cherry pick, it violates guideline principle B, where you are responsible to for the integrity of the data and the methods. If someone is disrespectful, promoting or condoning statistical misconduct, those are clear, obvious violations of the guidelines. That is the ethical issue. So identifying the ethical issue is greatly facilitated if you are familiar enough with the guidelines to understand what they say and how they apply. At this point in your career, with the guidelines, you may be overwhelmed. It's 8 pages. Oh my God, how am I going to find every single behavior and look through the entire guideline to figure out what is going on or what the ethical issue is? You can use the guidelines and the tasks to pinpoint where you are. So if you go back to the matching task we were looking at originally, you might say, okay, this person wants me to cherry pick results. So you're clearly not at planning. You're clearly not at wrangling. You're clearly not at analysis. You're at interpretation. So that's the task where cherry picking is most relevant, or reporting. Those are 2 key tasks. Now you would look through the guidelines for principles that relate to reporting and interpretation. And that way you narrow the scope of what you need to look for in the guidelines, and you will find multiple guideline principle elements that pertain to not cherry picking, reporting things honestly, being transparent about what you've done, and reporting what you did to maintain the integrity of the data and the results. So you can use the guidelines and the tasks together in order to execute number 3, identify the ethical issue. Hopefully, it's going to be very rare for you when this happens, and the remaining ethical reasoning, knowledge, skills, and abilities, or KSAs, are for those rare situations. So we just went through how number 3, identify an ethical issue. The guidelines help you pinpoint it. When you say what about what you're doing, planning, or have observed is inconsistent with the guidelines, and that is how you can identify the ethical issue. Once you have identified an ethical issue, something must be done. You have to decide what to do. And KSA, ethical reasoning KSA number 4, is to identify and evaluate alternative actions. So you have the guidelines, you have your tasks, you've identified that something is in violation of the guidelines. Now what do? You have to identify your alternative actions. The first thing, there are always 3 alternatives, no matter what the situation, you always have these 3. There are other alternatives, but they are going to be situationally specific. These 3 options always pertain. Do nothing, either don't just ignore it, or if somebody asks you to cherry pick, just do it, or consult with someone, ask someone. I think this is going on, the guidelines say A, this person did B, what do I do? Or if the person has pushed an old lady down, that's clearly an assault, you can see that it is a violation of policy, procedure, ethical guidelines, or law, so you report them. These 3 things always pertain. That's not to say that they are the best decision. So you do need to evaluate your alternatives. When you consider these 3 options, again, instead of thinking, wow, there's a whole universe of things I can do, you're trying to narrow down your set of options, and these 3 options are the easiest way to narrow down what you should do. If you've identified an ethical challenge, you do have to do something. If you do nothing, or you ignore the request, or you accept the request, you have made a choice. You have done something, and that is ignore this violation of the ethical guidelines. It's not an ethical option, but it is an option. Doing nothing is unethical in that it promotes misconduct, statistical or professional or scientific misconduct. It promotes or condones faulty work, potential waste of resources, or other human rights violations. So doing nothing is always an option, but it is never an ethical option. The second option, which is always available to you, is to consult or confer with a peer or a supervisor. You can use the professional guidelines up through number 3, which is how you identified the ethical issue in the first place, to structure your question. You can say, hi, colleague, I'm in a bit of a situation. I observed X, and that's contrary to the ethical guidelines. What do you reckon I should do? It's so much more straightforward if you have use the task to pinpoint where should you look in the guidelines, then you have the guideline and you see the situation clearly in terms of, I saw this, the guidelines say that's not right. What do you think I should do? But you should be aware, some people will say, just do nothing. There's nothing you can do, just let it go. They are advising you to do the unethical option. So that shouldn't be the end of your consulting. If you consult or confer with a colleague and they say do nothing, ignore it, or just follow the request, they're telling you to do something unethical, which is against the guidelines. You need to find somebody else to ask. Your last choice, which is always available to you, is to report a violation of policy, procedure, ethical guideline, or law. This is known as whistleblowing. This might be easier if you try option B first, reporting or conferring with somebody. You may find that the other people in your department or your program say, oh my God, yes, that person's always pushing down old ladies in crosswalks. I don't understand why, but nobody ever, what can we do? The more people who say, hey, stop pushing old ladies down in the sidewalk, those you may be able to aggregate evidence about unethical behavior and do something about it more convincingly if you have more people on your side. Okay. So identifying and evaluating alternative actions is important. Notice that if you choose option B, you consult with a peer and the person says, oh, you should do nothing. You're evaluating that option. Your evaluation of that option is actually option A. That's unethical. I can't do that. So the next thing that you do after you've identified different alternatives, either these 3 or others that are relevant for you, you have to make and justify a decision. If you can't justify a decision or the justification, do nothing. The justification of do nothing is it's easier, it's faster, I can get past this more quickly or simply. that guy or that person is a terrible person and will ruin my career, those are not very good justifications for choosing ignore this or just accept the request. So thinking about the justification of your decision can help you realize, wow, doing nothing really is an unethical option. I need a different option. So KSA's 3, recognizing an ethical issue, and 4, identifying and evaluating alternative actions can be very challenging. But using the framework, using the tasks, and recognizing that doing nothing is not an ethical option help. And then making the decision is very straightforward. It's not easy, but it's going to be more straightforward. Then the final aspect of ethical reasoning is to reflect on the decision. This is very challenging because, we're working, we're just doing stuff all day, we're making decisions. You need to be able to make a decision, be able to justify it, and move on. But sometimes you have the opportunity to reflect. I did that this time, and in my consultation, I found that person keeps pushing people down on the sidewalk. We really need to do something about it. So I recognize that was a short-term fix. We might need a longer-term solution. I need to reflect on that a bit. So just to quickly summarize, the ethical reasoning, knowledge, skills, and abilities, or KSAs, typically go in order. You will spend most of your career just operating at KSA number 1, understanding how to do your job as ethically as you can, not necessarily responding to other people's attempts at bad behavior. But when you recognize or identify that people are not acting in a manner that is consistent with the guidelines, or they are asking you to behave in a way that is not consistent with the guidelines, an ethical issue is identified and you need to make a decision about what to do. Whatever is not consistent with the guidelines is probably the issue. But notice, murder and theft are not in the ethical guidelines. So that's not the only place you're going to be able to find what the ethical issue is. You need to identify and evaluate alternative actions, and then you need to make and justify your decision. So to summarize, data science and statistical practice are supported by the ASA ethical guidelines. Using the data science pipeline and the 7 tasks can help you reinforce your application or use of the ASA ethical guidelines, or to understand when ethical challenges have occurred. Different guideline principles apply to every task. So it's not just one principle, A, B, have professional accountability and integrity. Other guideline principles apply to every task in the pipeline, and not just at the start of the project or at the end of a project. Doing nothing is always an option and is almost always an unethical option. And for those of you for whom this is relevant, you can integrate this approach into the workplace, training, or policies. And if you are a mentor or a supervisor, you can help your mentees or supervisees understand the relevance of ethical practice by focusing on each task along the pipeline. So that's the end of the slides that I have. I realize I only left 5 minutes. That's my fault for not being able to join the discussion more fully, but I want to see if anybody has any questions.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, this is Helena Thompson. I noticed with all the ethical, because I used to work at a hospital, we did have to do a lot of training and tests, whether it was HIPAA compliance and different things there. But also when I applied to graduate school, I noticed when we had to do a thesis, that applied as well. And that was really one of the questions that I had in task 3, when you were talking about different things to comply with, especially when you make sure that your paper or your information is correct, or getting permission from the statistical information that you're receiving.
Right.
So I'm seeing a lot of relevance in terms of where I worked as well as when I was in school.
That's awesome. I'm really glad. And do you think the relevance is justified?
I do, because there's a lot that we had to follow. especially when it came down to work in a healthcare environment, as well as your paper when you're doing that, because you can't just write something and not either ask permission or make sure that it's correct information as far as statistics.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, so I appreciate that comment, and obviously I'm deep into the ASA ethical guidelines for statistical practice, and I am a statistician, so that's my main focus, is helping people who use statistics do so ethically. But also, I'm a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. My primary objective is to make sure that the scientific record has integrity, and that people do not publish nonsensical work. Because a clinician who is looking for advice or help or guidance on how to treat a patient has to read your trashy non-report. If you cherry pick the results, that may influence the treatment that they choose, that they ultimately go with. And if your report is not reproducible, then they are making an error and potentially putting their patients in harm's way. So the variety of ethical paradigms that you've described protect different stakeholders, I would say, whereas the ASA ethical guidelines for statistical and data science practice protect the scientific endeavor, broadly. That's my perspective anyway.
I agree. Thank you.
Excellent. Any other questions?
Yes. So William, yeah, thanks for your presentation. I have a question. So you have 7 guidelines or 5 guidelines. You have a whole set of guidelines.
Yep.
In your view, which one? I mean, how would you prioritize that? So, assuming you are in a situation where you don't want to cherry pick, but you are faced with a situation of whether to make sure the provenance is well done, or maybe the respect for others, or something else. Now you have to start somewhere. You can't just say I'm stuck.
Yes.
Let me go and solve this. Yeah. So how would you restack the deck of rules so that you can say, well, this is done, this is done, this is done, and this is going to be the nice to have.
Right. So I think that in that case, I would have to say that working on a team and respecting others in your community would be my last priority, because your institution already protects those people. You already are not supposed to sexually harass people. It doesn't stop them, but the guidelines are certainly not going to stop them from doing that. But the more subtle problems come with recognizing that you are responsible for your contribution to the scientific record. So principle A means you are accountable for falsely informing a physician, and he makes a decision and his patient dies. That's on you, man. The other principle B charges the practitioner with responsibility for maintaining the integrity of the data. So wrapped up in B is respect for subjects, animals, and humans. But A really says if the project is done and needs to be redone because you didn't report carefully, your reports are not reproducible, it's not valid, you are accountable for that, at least partly. So for me, those two really, again, that's preserving the scientific record and the integrity of the scientific record, which is my priority. That is not protected by anyone. So falsification, fraud, and plagiarism, FFP, that's the Office of Research Integrity's definition of misconduct. But that's not really protecting the scientific record from statistical misconduct and what the national academies have labeled misleading or disruptive research practices. And the statistician is really the only person, the person who handles the data is really the only person who can tell an investigator, you're corrupting the scientific record and wasting resources if you publish your cherry-picked results. I'm sure it's great for your CV and your grants getting in the future, but that view does not hold water for me. That's my personal perspective. But other people more policy-oriented people or more people-oriented people may prioritize protecting human subjects, protecting other people's rights. Those may be a priority for other people, but for me, A and B are the absolute priority because there are no other protections for those. And that's really the only way we can communicate to the practitioner that your accountability is driving the scientific enterprise. Even if other people in your team do not recognize it, you're usually the only person who can speak to that those issues. And you can use the document to say, look, this is what the ethical scientist does. I am an ethical scientist, so I cannot oblige you by cherry picking and sometimes you may need to withdraw from a project or take your name off a paper. I've done that.
That would be a very difficult, assuming that is your first or few or second paper. I mean, you definitely.
I totally agree. I totally agree. And early in your career, you may be struggling, but you need to look ahead to see if you're going to fill an NIH BioSketch out and articulate your contributions to science. Your contributions to science is to undermine it if you publish a report that cannot be reproduced. Do you see what I'm saying? So if you think about the long term, I completely understand that having fewer publications is a problem. I was there myself. And if you think about what you're going to be when you grow up, which is an ethical scientist, someone who improves knowledge rather than undermines it, publishing a paper makes your CV look better and the rest of the world worse.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay. Emmanuel, did you have a question?
Yes.
Okay.
We have situations where people carried out experiments without designing it, and
Yes.
which the statistician call after effects, and they want you to analyze it for them.
Yes.
For instance, it will have looked better if the experiments are replicated or this or that.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is the best approach? Is it to find a way to analyze the data or to reject it? Because with that situation we have seen it even from some graduate students. They will say, I want to analyze my data statistically, but the experiments do not lend themselves to statistical analysis. How do you
not only are you struggling because it's the provenance of the data is crazy, but the other side of the struggle is if you don't do it, either they're going to do it totally unethically and just report whatever, so they will do it badly and then create an undermining element in the scientific record, or you know, I mean, what happens is if you say no, it's not going to just not get done. So I completely understand the problem that you're having or that you're describing. And it's important to recognize the two sides of that. If you say no, that doesn't mean it's not going to go into the record. So one of the things that you have to do is balance your career stage and your role in that person's CV. Are you a mentor of that person? Do you have any influence or potential to advise them, or not? You know what I mean? That's something you need to. If you say no, what are they going to do in response to that? Are they going to punish you, or are they just going to go on to find another person to do it? The other sort of aspect is to think, you know, all of these responsibilities exist when you are engaged in an analysis. But if you are not engaged in the analysis, so you did not design the study or whatever, then you can ethically say, you know, that is not my problem. If I accept the assignment, it becomes my problem. But right now, it's not my problem. So you always have that option, especially when the person is going to punish you. So if you're early in your career and you say, no, I can't analyze that data, or that's not going to work, or whatever, stepping away may be your career preserving option. But that sort of looks like you're ignoring the problem or letting it happen or condoning or appearing to condone statistics and scientific misconduct. So that is a problem. And the earlier you are in your career, you need to balance those two challenges. But if you're more senior in your career, more confident, less punishable, you can, if you have time, try to come up with a way to get the person to describe their work as exploratory and descriptive. The key is for them not to overstate their results and interpret one p-value in 77 tests as the truth, the new truth. So if you have time, you can help the person characterize their work correctly and then do whatever the analysis is as a purely exploratory or descriptive exercise, helping them to realize that if you didn't design an experiment, you're not testing a hypothesis, and testing the null hypothesis helps no one. No one cares about the null hypothesis. That's why it's called the null. It has no value. So there are ways, depending on your stage and your relationship with the requester, to sort of help turn their potential very bad contribution to the scientific base into something that is less offensive and problematic, because the clinician who comes down the pike and sees the report isn't going to say, oh, you know, frog spawn cures cancer because so-and-so did this random experiment and that's what happened. So if it's characterized as exploratory and descriptive, that lowers the negativity of that if it ever gets into the scientific record. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Rachel. Very excellent presentation. And I'm glad you talked about the KS for the alternative actions. So if one have exhausted all the options that you indicated, how does a data scientist or data, what is the balance between ethics of data science and preserving institutional privacy and policies?
Yeah. So
is there a balance somewhere?
There is a balance, and you have to be aware of the institutional sort of rules and policies. So it's important to recognize. Now, actually, I get this question a lot. People say, without looking at the guidelines at all, they will say, the guidelines can't possibly tell me what to do better than the policy of my institution, which is completely false. It is very powerful to say, my institution created policies about sexual harassment, for example, 40 years ago. And you know what? The guidelines agree. They also say you should be respectful of humans. You shouldn't violate their rights in any way. So it can strengthen your position to recognize when your policy, your institutional policies and the guidelines overlap. It makes me a better professional to follow my guidelines. And by the way, I'm also following my institutional guidelines. If you ever identify a case where the ASA ethical guidelines tell you to do something that is against your institution's policy, A, absolutely call me. I need to know about that. But B, I think you need to read either the guideline or the policy again, because they should not disagree. The other sort of side to that coin is sort of related to my answer to William's question, which is when you are prioritizing what to do, the question is, who is the beneficiary? Who is the stakeholder? And look at harms and benefits. The harm to your institution, if you refuse to share confidential data, is minimal. The harm to the individuals who contributed that data, believing you would preserve the integrity of the data and their confidentiality expectations, is huge. So you may say, from a utilitarian perspective, there's a harm to the institution and there's a harm to the data contributor. But in fact, the harms are completely different. They are not exchangeable. And one of the most important things, one of the most important statistical concepts that applies to ethical considerations is exchangeability. There may be a benefit to you doing something quickly, accepting a data request just because it gets out of your queue faster. But the potential harm that you do to the scientific record by accepting that is so much greater. It's so much heavier of a burden that the benefit is completely ignorable. It goes away. So when you are considering prioritization, you really do need to consider stakeholders and the absolute unexchangeability of harms and benefits to the different stakeholders. That can help you make decisions when priorities seem to conflict or you're not really sure where to start. You need to, if you have time, think about harms and benefits, recognizing that they will never be exchangeable. And I did, in the 2 books that I've written, I've done complete case analyses, including stakeholder analyses with harms and benefits. And I did 56 cases. Every single case, the benefits are absolutely minor. It saves you time or effort or documentation. And the benefits are privacy breaches, public trust breaches, undermining the scientific record. Those are truly significant harms. And the benefits are really minor or trivial, or they only pertain to one person. So really conceptualizing who the stakeholder is and what the harms or benefits may be can be really helpful in a prioritizing exercise if that's what you're faced with. Sheila, did you have a question? I'm sorry. Oh, okay.
Sorry, I had a question.
Okay.
So you make a
Who are
really
you?
compelling.
Sorry, who is it?
So the name is Malik.
Oh, okay.
Malik.
Right. Yep. See you. Okay.
So you make a really compelling case for how the benefits are basically nil or negligible, and the harms are just astronomical. Do you
Yep.
think the punitive measures that are in place right now are enough to dissuade people from engaging in such unethical acts, or do you think they need to be strengthened? What do you think about that?
Okay, so I want to thank you for this question. This is a really deep question, and it technically does not matter what I think. But I also feel like I want to make sure to thank John for the invitation to come and make this presentation to you. And part of the reason why I do this kind of work is because the only way we can create peer pressure and awareness that the scientific record, the public trust, and the very rare resource that is federal funding for our research, these things are all at risk. And we violate the public trust by doing irreproducible research. So the punitive aspects are really profound, but difficult to perceive. If you are new to the career, I mean, I've been a statistician for a really long time, and you used to apply for a grant and have a 33% chance of getting an NIH grant, and now it's 2%. So I was there when it was common, and now it's rare, and the public trust being decimated or declining. Public trust is directly tied to funding. If the public decides that NIH is wasting its money, none of us will ever work again. So there are some very, very significant, culturally and financially significant punitive features to unethical behavior that are really, really hard to perceive, but they are incredible. So the challenge is that people who do not care about their next grant or the public financing of science more largely, they are solely focused on their own careers, their own CVs, and their own labs. They don't technically care about the scientific record. There is no punishment that will change that person's perspective. Maybe they were trained that way, to be focused on their own CVs rather than their ability to contribute to science. I will point out that the NIH's shift, the new biosketch that asks for your contributions to science, is really an inroad towards understanding just publishing isn't enough. That people can't just publish 700 papers and say, I am an important scientist. That's really a careless scientist who will put their name on anything. 700 papers in 20 years is crazy. But a thoughtful scientist who can characterize the actual needle-moving contributions they make to science, that's a reward. So when you think about punishment versus reward, you have to think about incentives and disincentives. I am incentivized to make science better, to promote public trust in publicly funded work. I'm motivated by that. So when people say, you know, you make a good argument that people should be statistically ethical or whatever, that's a reward for me. The punishments are much more difficult because of all these, they're hard to see, they're more diffuse, and they don't show up in your CV, especially if you decide not to publish a paper or to take your name off a paper, you are clearly unrewarded. You're disincentivized from doing that. I absolutely recognize that. So when you talk about punishments, that was against the law. So don't do it or you're going to jail. There's the fraud, falsification, and plagiarism punishment, which with NSF is you will never get NSF funding again. With NIH, it's you will never get NIH funding again for 3 years. And then it'll be like you never falsified your data. So welcome back and here's some money. I mean, so the punishment is actually very strange, but it's the incentives and the disincentives that are, we really need as a group, we need to convince our colleagues, we need to incentivize them to be ethical, to make true contributions to the scientific knowledge base rather than simply contributing to the length of their CV. Those incentives make disincentives. If you become known as a person who cherry picks, hopefully none of the statisticians on your hall will ever work with that person. And that disincentivizes that bad behavior. So only by notifying our peers that we intend to follow the guidelines, exhibiting this behavior, promoting ethical behavior, and having conversations like this one, that's the only way we can create incentives and undermine the disincentives that exist. But I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but the punishment aspect is sort of, it's very difficult because you have to have this was wrong. It's always wrong in every single case. And there's a law about it for there to be a punishment. It's very difficult to punish these other bad behaviors.
Rochelle, I have a question.
Okay.
First, I'll thank you for an excellent presentation. My name is Kwesi. And my question is, when institutional politics, ethics, and survival intersects, how does it play out, as you know, in the field?
Well, I think it kind of relates to Malik's question, or my answer to Malik's question, that there is a set of disincentives, and that includes sort of social or, bad opinion. So if the breach affects opinions about your institution, then obviously the institution will suffer, and it is a disincentive for them. So for example, I'm at Georgetown University, and one of the, I just had a sabbatical in 2019. So what they said was, you can do pretty much whatever you want on your sabbatical, but it needs to promote sort of the goodness of Georgetown, it needs to promote Georgetown. So in my proposal, I had to say, I'm going to write a book about ethical data science, and that will make Georgetown look better because Georgetown loves ethics. We have a Kennedy Institute of Ethics, we have a Pellegrino Center for Bioethics, and here I am, promoting ethical data science. So my book won't harm the public perception of Georgetown. It may strengthen it. So you have these really very considerable but squishy contributions to the institutional or political sort of things that you're thinking about. But I will also say Georgetown and Howard have a really weird relationship, and the politics of institutional engagement are really weird. If you're not, I don't even know how to describe it. So it's difficult to say, they like it when X happens or they hate it when Y happens. It's very difficult to sort of even describe these things. So they're really squishy. So when you think about a policy and the guidelines, they're written. So of course they should be prioritized because they're formal and everyone can find them and see. Whereas the politics and the more interpersonal bits are person specific, sometimes situational. And so those, I'm not saying they're not important, but they are very difficult to navigate. And, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it's not as easy as it sounds to say, well, you've written this policy, therefore I'm going to act consistently with this policy. And by the way, the guidelines say I should do that. If there's sort of political will to do something else, it doesn't matter how well you justify what you're doing. So there's that sort of truth, but you are the author of your professional narrative. If you believe you are acting with integrity and you are a professional and you're demonstrating your own integrity to yourself, the institution where you work is secondary. And when the institution or organization you work for diverges from your professional identity and your ability or desire to act with integrity, you need to reconsider whether or not that's a place you want to work. That's a difficult thing to say to, I have tenure. I mean, I have golden handcuffs. I can't leave. No one else would hire me. But the master's and doctoral level students that I have talked to who are doing internships and what's it called, where they have a professional placement, what they have to complete to get their degree, they have absolutely, almost all of them said, yes, I need to find a different job, or I cannot work for this place. So at the end of my internship, I have to leave. So again, that is an option, but it seems kind of strange if you can't say, well, here are the guidelines, or here is a definition of professional integrity that I want to align myself with. So that's where I'm going. Working for Google will not be consistent with my worldview, my professional identity. So I'm not going to work for Google. So I feel like, again, it's important for everyone who has influence over developing and newly aware practitioners to promote thinking about these things and their professional identity so that they can make defensible decisions and sleep at night with the decisions that they've made. Kwasi, I don't know if I answered your question.
I think so, Karen.
Okay.
Yeah, any further questions?
Yeah.
Rochelle, I have another hypothetical question here. Let's say as a data scientist or statistician, I'm hired by a certain organization, maybe clinical trials, whatever. I'm hired to do this, help them design the study, do the analysis, and then give back to them my report.
Right.
Now, let's say I see something in there that perhaps is very detrimental to the consumer.
Right.
And then the institution decided, well, we are not going to publish it. Do I have any ethical responsibility? I'm done with my job. They asked me to do this. I'm done with it. I'm paid. Do I have any ethical responsibility?
Right. Well, so there's two ways to answer that question. Unfortunately for all of you, one way isn't the short way and the long way. They're all the long way. So in a straight up ethics conversation, like if you talk to somebody who was a trained ethicist, they would say your primary obligation is to your own sort of safety and health. So if reporting this detrimental to the consumer attribute that you found can harm you in any way, then you are not ethically obliged to report it. If they're going to punish you or not hire you or fire you or something like that, ethically, you are not obliged to report it. A. B, you may be able to notify someone. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, controls commercial speech with respect to products, any kind of product, to protect the consumer. So you may be able to notify them anonymously. So there are ways to do some kind of reporting or whistleblowing that are not going to identify you, and so you would not be putting yourself in danger, or your livelihood or your family. So those are sort of extreme examples. But I would encourage you, and I have actually encouraged many people to do this, where they find something absolutely absurd and crazy that a company or an organization is promoting, to do and then publish, for peer review and publish a simulation study that points out, for example, how if that thing was really doing, cleaning the air or whatever, then X would happen. Particulates should never be detected directly above an air filter or whatever it is. So you can do a simulation study and prove with your simulation that whatever it is that's the problem that you detected is unrealistic or unlikely or something like that. In that way, you've actually done a scientifically valid thing that you have submitted for peer review. And instead of saying, hey, company X, you are harming the public or whatever, you will actually introduce into the literature evidence that what they're doing is harmful or false or wrong or something like that. So that's really effortful, but you get a paper out of it. And, you know, it can be worked into your actual work to address this problem. You can give your students a task. You can use this as a case study to discuss with your students why you're doing this. You know, it can be a real learning experience for everyone involved, and also have the net result of offering new and, you know, valid evidence against or for whatever your argument is. So there are a lot of ways that you can legitimately address the concern that you have. Some are really quick, ignore it. Some are much more effortful, but have a more pervasive effect than just complaining or whistleblowing would have. So you definitely have a lot of options. Ignoring the problem or not reporting it is defensible, but there are, trying to remember who is the philosopher that had these 3 tests to determine if any action that you have taken is a good action. One is, would you be willing for everyone to find out that you knew about this problem and did nothing? That's the test of publicity. Another one is, if somebody else had the option of telling people that this was a problem and they took it or didn't take it, would you be affected? Would you think, oh my God, why didn't you tell us that that vacuum cleaner didn't take particulates out of the air? So that's the test of universality. And the third test, it's in my book and I can't remember what it is, but the test of publicity and the test of universality are really, really important tests just in general to see if the option you've chosen is a worthwhile one, or one you would hope other people would take. So I don't know if that answers your question. Also, I want to be, okay. So I want to be respectful of people's time. It's 12:30 and I apologize for taking extra time to start, but I don't actually have somewhere I need to be until, you know, after 1 o'clock. So if people want to keep asking questions, I'm happy to keep answering, but I want to just make sure you all recognize you're a half hour past your time.
Oh, well, Rachel, they are enjoying it. That's why they are still here.
Or they forgot to log out. They left for their next appointment and forgot to log out. But I understand. But anyway, yeah. So if people have other questions, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah. So I have one more question, and that'll be good. So at a point, listening to you and looking at the rules, I said to myself, the burden of proof at times is also on the side of the scientific community, right?
Mm-hmm.
So someone has turned in, or someone has published a publication or research that is not reproducible, and then you ask yourself, how did it get through the peer review? We have automated scripts, we have Jupyter Lab, our studio. All you have to enforce is, hey, put your data here, put your program here, and then I just click run, and I should be able to reproduce. Right. So how is that possible, given everything that we have to the scientific community?
Yeah. So one of the biggest challenges that the statistical community faces is that anyone can use statistics and data science. Anyone with a finger or, you know, implement to push a button can get statistics and data science results out of anything. That's one of the reasons why the ethical guidelines say, if you are using statistical methods, these guidelines pertain to you. Now, the problem is the only people who are required to read these things are members of the American Statistical Association. So the ASA has teaching statistics in the health sciences listservs or groups. They have sections for teaching data science and statistics to undergraduates, and the individual members read the guidelines, but it's very difficult to incorporate this into how we teach people to push the button and get a mean or, you know, t-test out of Excel. How do we do it? So the ASA Committee on Professional Ethics, the COPE, has been struggling with how to get this information out to more people, but not just hand them the guidelines, but explain, as you all sat through, a quite lengthy and super detailed discussion about how to use the guidelines in different ways. It's not easy, and it's not easy to do if you're committed to it because it's what you do for a living, or you want to feel like you have professional integrity, or you want to demonstrate your professional integrity, then you'd be much more motivated to do it. But if you're a student, a medical student, for example, and you don't learn anything about experimental design, you certainly don't learn anything about ethical practice of data science or statistics, why would you even look for these things? So that's really actually the reason why I wrote one of the books. It's for everybody's first stats class, that the teacher or the student would be able to read that book and understand exactly what I've described today, ethical reasoning and the guidelines, and how to use what you know to determine whether or not what you're doing is ethical, practice ethically, and then just in case you end up with a problem, how to respond to the problem. The second book is for practitioners or proto-practitioners, so people who are going to be data scientists, are going to be a statistician. And it's a whole book of case analyses. There's between 5 and 10 cases for each of the tasks, so that you can see the ethical reasoning process worked through using the ACM code, the ASA code, the data science ethics frame checklist, and the data ethics framework that was put out by the UK Ministry for Data in 2018. So there are tools that exist, but you have to learn how to use them. And so, I mean, I wrote a book, obviously, I hope people will use it, but the point is, it's not easy. So informing people that these things exist, telling them, no, it's not easy, but you can learn how to do it, and making sure that Alicia and Ella can ask Aya or Claudia, what do you think I should do here? Letting other people know that you're interested in having a conversation, conferring with your peers, asking questions. That's the only way we can incentivize our community to practice more ethically, train people more ethically, and notify them that if you're using statistics or data science, you have obligations to do so ethically. Even if you're an accountant, even if you're a chemist or a biologist, when you're analyzing your data or designing an experiment or using data science tools to understand the genome or whatever, you still have obligations to do so ethically. So I don't know if that answers your question, William. It's complex. So, I mean,
Yes.
I would say employment security for me, but this is what I do in my spare time. This isn't not my job, but like I said, my commitment is to the scientific record.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, any further questions for Rochelle? Obviously, Rochelle enjoys talking about ethics and data science. I'm sure she'll be here till 2 o'clock if you have any
That's
questions.
right. Yeah,
Those
that's
of you
true.
who want to leave, thank you for coming. Make sure you sign, you complete the survey.
Yes,
And
please
then,
complete the survey. That's really important for me to know what was helpful and what was less helpful. And if there's something you think I should have emphasized, or if I get invited back to give another talk, what would you like to know more about? Please,
right.
please.
And next week is the regular instructional module 6. That will be on classification models, and that is from instructor Dr. Saga from University of Maryland. Those of you who were here from the beginning, he gave the instruction for module 1. Also, there will be VADSTI AWS, that is Amazon Web Services program coming up. Check Slack, and then if you are interested in any of those, you have to sign up. I think the application deadline is April the 12th. Again, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Rochelle, for a very informative and very engaging presentation. Thank you so much.
I just have one more question.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead. Rochelle is still here.
Yeah, I'm here.
you had mentioned, this is Helena again, the books, you have published 2 books, you were saying?
Yeah, they're
what
not
were the
published yet. They're not published yet.
Okay. All right then. So I look forward to when they are published.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, great.
Any further questions? Okay, so it looks like we've exhausted with all the questions. So again, thank you, Rochelle, for coming, and thank you all for coming, and then have a great.
So before you hang up, specifically Helena had asked in task 3, would this apply towards dissertation, thesis, as well as task or project? Yes. Whenever you are using statistics or data science, if you're planning, doing analysis, wrangling, it the tasks apply, and so do the guidelines. No matter what your level is, those apply. And Malik, it wasn't Socrates. I think it was German, and in the 1800s. And I'm still blanking on his name, but definitely not Socrates. But thanks for that. Nope, earlier than Popper, but later than Socrates.
Thank you.
Good, you're on fire, Malik. Okay, so those are the only questions that I had in the chat. So I apologize for not getting to that earlier.
All right, so see you all next week for Module 6.
Enjoy the weather. Thanks for the invitation.
It depends on the part of where they are. They are coming from all over the world. So.
Oh, wow, okay. All right, thanks very much.
All right.